Hello, Blake Rudis. I'm back again with day 2 of our 30 Days of Photoshop Mastery Challenge. Now, day 1, we talked about some basic stuff, didn't we? We talked about the Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, what's included in it, and how to update Photoshop, which doesn't seem like that big of a task, but I guarantee you that even some Photoshop seasoned veterans have forgotten or don't know how to update Photoshop. And they come out with updates occasionally, so you do want to make sure that you check that. The second thing we're going to discuss here on day 2 is going to be the 3 parts that create or make up Photoshop. And those 3 parts are going to be Photoshop, obviously, Bridge, and Adobe Camera Raw. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, Blake, why not Lightroom? I know that Lightroom is actually a part of the Photoshop ecosystem. It's called Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. However, we aren't going to be discussing it in this entire 30-day Photoshop challenge because I want to stick to Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop. Lightroom essentially is a beautiful combination of Bridge and Camera Raw. When you understand how these two work and how they interface with Photoshop, it will make your understanding of Lightroom better as well. I do not use Lightroom. It's just a personal preference. I've told myself, don't install Lightroom because if you do, how often are you actually going to jump into Photoshop? So because I didn't want to have a crutch, so to speak, that I would use as a handicap and lean on Lightroom all the time instead of going into Photoshop, I have decided not to use Lightroom. Okay, that's my personal preference, and it might not be your preference, and I'm totally okay with that. But you came here to learn Photoshop, not Lightroom. So the 3 parts to Photoshop, as I discussed, they are Bridge, in order, Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop. Photoshop itself is a place where you go and you edit your images, whether they be JPEGs or TIFF files, but if your camera shoots RAW, Photoshop itself cannot actually process a RAW file. It needs a place to do that first. And that's where Adobe Camera Raw comes in. Any RAW file that you double click to open, if you've told it to open in Photoshop, will go through Adobe Camera Raw first for initial processing, okay? And the reason why it does that is that Photoshop doesn't have the ability to process or edit a raw image. There's a handoff that happens between Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop that it goes from a raw image to basically a floating kind of document in Photoshop that would be equivalent to a 16-bit TIFF. And then once you are done editing your image in Photoshop, you have to determine whether you're going to save it out as a TIFF or as a JPEG or some other file that you're going to use online or wherever it is that you might use that. So Bridge now becomes the place that you can look at where all of your photos are on your computer. So Bridge becomes basically a window into what's happening inside your computer. I prefer to use Bridge because of the way that I put the files that I get from my camera into my computer. The Lightroom process wants you to import those things into Lightroom and export them out of Lightroom. To me, that's too much control. I don't want a program to control that. And if I ever want to leave the Lightroom ecosystem, all of the edits, all the things that I ever did in Lightroom are stuck in Lightroom. So that's another reason why I've decided to go the Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop method for my workflow. You're going to hear me say the word workflow quite a bit in this 30 days because workflow is a very critical topic for me. It's very important that you have a good, solid, efficient workflow. So let's take a look at Bridge. Bridge is basically just a window into your PC or your Mac that shows you where the folders are on your PC or your Mac. So wherever you put those photos, you can find them. You can even copy and paste their location from where they are on your computer into here and find them here. When you open up one of these, let's open up this one, for instance, here, you're going to see a series of photographs that are in here. This mirrors and looks exactly like the folder and where it is on my desktop. So if I were to actually copy this and then open up the File Explorer here and paste this into here, you'll see that this is exactly what I'm seeing in Bridge. So Bridge is basically just a window into your computer. We'll talk a lot more about Bridge in the next lesson. I just want to show you these 3 parts because if I were to open up one of these RAW files, if you see here, let's just double click this RAW file. If I double click this RAW file, it's going to take me to the second part of Photoshop. Now what you'll see is that it's opening up Photoshop here, but as it's opening up Photoshop, it's going to have to pass into Adobe Camera Raw to then get into Photoshop so I can process it. The quicker you understand this ecosystem and how it works with RAW files, the better. Because I didn't shoot in RAW for a very long time. I'd say probably for 2 years as a digital photographer, I didn't shoot in RAW because I thought this step was redundant. I was like, why is it doing this to me? I just want to edit my photos. So I shot in JPEG on purpose because I didn't want to edit a raw file. And that's crazy. That happened way back in like 2007. So, don't hold it against me now. But that's crazy to think about, that I would be passing up all that beautiful raw data in my image just because I was uncomfortable with the ecosystem. So the reason why I'm showing you this today, you might think that this is very basic knowledge, but I'm showing you this ecosystem of Photoshop so that you understand why we do the things that we do. Why do we shoot in RAW? Well, we shoot in RAW so we can get the most data out of our images, because a JPEG has compressed data. A RAW file does not. So I shoot in RAW in my camera so I can get all the data that I want to edit. And when you understand what Adobe Camera Raw is and why your RAW file is going in here, that's because this file is going to need some work. If I were to just shoot this as a JPEG, it would look like this and be in a stuck state. But as a RAW file, if I press, the auto button here and then maybe manipulate some of the color temperature here, I actually have a photo that I can work with. We'll talk a lot more about Adobe Camera Raw in one of the later lessons, but I just want to show you what's happening here. We go from Bridge to open up our photo to then go into Adobe Camera Raw to process the image. If I say done, it's going to take me back into Bridge where I opened up this photo from. If I say cancel, it's not going to save any of the things that I want to do on here. But if I say open image, it'll then hand this image off into Photoshop. Now, here's the other cool thing though. If you don't want to use Bridge, if Bridge is something that you just don't want to do, okay, we can open up that image directly from our folder that we have here on our PC. So this is my PC folder and where all these images live. If I double click any one of these RAW files, it's going to open it up in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, that one of the reasons why this is working this way is because I've told Photoshop to handle all of my images as they come in. I want Photoshop to open up JPEGs. I want it to open up RAW files. I want it to open up TIFFs. I want Photoshop to open every possible photo when I double click it. That's one of my personal preferences. But if yours is not doing that, if you're in a PC right here, you can right click on this image here. You can say properties and you can tell it where you want it to open. I want this, I'm going to change this so that this opens in Photoshop CC 2020. As you can see, all my RAW files were actually opening up in Photoshop CC 2019 as their default app because I still haven't updated this since Photoshop 2020 came out. Another good reminder that's coming in this video that you're watching right now is that when Adobe goes from 2020 to 2021, you may need to do this so that the images that you have open in the latest version of Photoshop. So I'll press OK, and then I'll press OK here, and then I'll press apply. That's basically going to tell my computer anytime I open up a RAW file from my camera, this .arw file, it's going to open up in Photoshop. So if I right click this and say properties, you're going to see that the icon now changed to the Photoshop CC 2020 icon. Now, if you have multiple cameras, you might have to do this for multiple cameras. Just find the RAW file for whatever it is that you're going to be working with, right click that file and say open in Photoshop, and press OK. I also do this with JPEG files. So let's see if we have some JPEGs around here somewhere. It looks like these are just random folders that I'm actually going into now. I'm just going to go in here. Okay, here's a JPEG. I'm going to right click this. I'm going to say properties, and I'm going to say where I want this to open. I want this to open up in Adobe Photoshop 2020 and press OK. OK. Okay. So that way, any JPEG or any RAW file is now going to open up in Photoshop. If you want any of those things to open up in Photoshop, this is going to be your homework before we move on to Bridge tomorrow. So your homework for today is to just get a basic understanding for the 3 parts to Photoshop. Photoshop is primarily the place that we're going to be editing our photos, yes, but it comes with Bridge so that we can see our images, and it comes with Adobe Camera Raw so that we can edit our RAW files. Now, I know that this topic is not sexy. It's not the fun thing that you signed up for this 30-day challenge for, but it's important. Why is that important? Because now you need to tell all of your photos that you want to open up in Photoshop to open up in Photoshop. So your homework, take a look at these things. Just take a look at Bridge. Just take a look at Adobe Camera Raw. Open up a RAW file if you have one on your computer and just kind of play around with it and see what it does. We're going to get into Adobe Camera Raw in another lesson. In tomorrow's lesson, we're going to be doing an overview of Bridge. If you use Lightroom and Lightroom extensively, I'd still like you to watch these videos so that you understand the Photoshop ecosystem as it works with Bridge. Because Lightroom is essentially a prettier version of the Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw experience.